The sledgehammer hit the concrete wall for the third time before Marcus Chen realized the building's blueprints were lying to him. 15 years of demolition work had taught him to trust his hands more than paper. The wall shouldn't exist according to the 1964 architectural plans for the Agricultural Research Center in Langley, Virginia. Yet here it was, 8 inches of reinforced concrete where the sub-basement should have opened into a simple storage area. Marcus ran his palm across the surface. The concrete was different from the surrounding structure. Poured separately, years after the original construction. The rebar grid visible through the broken section was excessive, the kind of reinforcement you'd use for a bomb shelter, not an interior partition. He should have stopped, called the property manager, followed protocol. Instead, he nodded to Tommy Rodriguez, and they kept breaking through. 20 minutes later, Marcus squeezed through a hole barely wide enough for his shoulders and dropped into a room that had been sealed for 29 years. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness and found them. 4 industrial filing cabinets lined against the far wall. The air rushing past him into the void smelled of dust and paper and something else he couldn't identify. Not decay, exactly. More like preservation. Like someone had locked this room and walked away, intending for it to stay hidden forever. The room was 20 feet square. No windows, no other entrance. Just the cabinets, a metal desk, a chair, and bare concrete walls. On the desk sat a leather logbook, its cover warped with age. Beside it, a coffee cup with dried residue at the bottom, as if someone had been working here, set down their cup, and simply vanished mid-sentence. Tommy came through behind him, playing his own light around the space. He moved to the nearest cabinet and pulled the handle. Locked. They all were. Then Marcus saw the metal plates riveted to each cabinet's frame, and his stomach dropped. CIA, classified, Office of Scientific Intelligence. Tommy was already backing toward the opening, but Marcus wasn't looking at him anymore. He'd noticed something behind the cabinets, and he moved closer despite every instinct telling him to leave. Someone had written on the concrete wall in black marker, though the ink had faded to brownish gray over the decades. Not graffiti, not random notes, names, hundreds of them, covering a section of wall 3 feet square, written in cramped columns. Girls' names, each followed by a year. Sarah Whitmore, 1953, Jennifer Cole, 1954. Margaret Dern, 1952. Patricia Hughes, 1955. Ruth Ann Castellano, 1956. The list went on, filling every available inch of concrete. At the bottom, in larger, more desperate letters, someone had written, "They told us we were saving the country. God forgive us for what we did to these children." Marcus stood there for a long moment, his flashlight beam steady on those words, and felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of the building he'd been demolishing for the past week. This hadn't been an agricultural research center. Whatever had happened here, someone had wanted it buried. Not destroyed, buried. There was a difference. You destroyed evidence when you wanted it gone forever. You buried it when you couldn't quite bring yourself to erase it completely. When some part of you believed that maybe, someday, someone should know. He climbed back through the opening and sent Tommy upstairs to make the calls. Dr. Helen Carey arrived at the site 3 hours later, after the FBI had secured the building and people without identifying badges had pushed the FBI aside. She'd been pulled from her evening at home with a phone call that gave her just enough information to know this was serious and not nearly enough to prepare her for what she'd find. 12 years as a CIA historian had exposed her to plenty of buried secrets. She'd written the internal history of MK-Ultra, the mind control experiments that had finally been exposed in the 1970s. She'd cataloged operations that would never be declassified. She knew how to read between the lines of sanitized documents and see the human cost beneath the clinical language. But she'd never been summoned to an active discovery site like this. The senior officer waiting for her in the sub-basement was named Thatcher. Gray-haired, tired-eyed, the kind of career intelligence officer who'd spent decades keeping secrets and had the weight of them etched into the lines of his face. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He showed her the room, the cabinets, now forced open, and the tables where their contents had been carefully arranged. Helen moved to the nearest table and picked up a file at random. Morrison, Elizabeth, age 8. Intake date, June 15, 1954. The first page was a standard CIA medical examination form from the 1950s, handwritten across the top in red ink. OSI Recruitment, Priority Alpha, Office of Scientific Intelligence, the division that had run the early experiments before MK-Ultra, before the oversight and the scandals. The true believers who'd thought they could win the Cold War through science that looked more like sorcery. She flipped through the file. Physical measurements, psychological testing, IQ scores of 142. And then, perceptual sensitivity evaluation. Subject shows 87th percentile response to baseline ESP protocols. Recommend advancement to Phase 2, ESP. Extrasensory perception. They'd been testing children for psychic abilities. The last page in the file was a death certificate from Philadelphia County. Elizabeth Morrison, drowned, August 3, 1954. Body identified by St. Catherine's Orphanage staff. Paper clipped behind it. A medical examination form dated September 12, 1954. More than a month after Elizabeth had supposedly died. Helen set down the Morrison file with hands that had gone cold and reached for the thickest folder on the table. Whitmore, Sarah, age 9. Intake date, March 22, 1953. The file was easily 3 times the size of the others, and as Helen began reading, she understood why. Sarah Whitmore had been exceptional. Selected from Philadelphia Children's Home by a recruiter operating under academic cover. Initial testing showed spatial reasoning in the 99th percentile, and what the assessor called unprecedented intuitive response patterns on modified Zener card trials. Her death certificate was dated April 7, 1953. House fire at a foster placement. Remains identified through dental records. Her medical examinations continued until December 1957. 4.5 years of documented training, testing, and conditioning. Helen read through it all, forcing herself to maintain the analytical distance she'd cultivated over years of reviewing terrible things. It didn't work. The clinical language made it worse somehow. The careful measurements of a child's psychological breaking points. The notation of when resistance turned to compliance. The tracking of abilities that shouldn't exist, refined through methods that absolutely shouldn't have been used on a 9-year-old. Year 1. Remote viewing protocols. Describe contents of sealed envelopes. Success rate, 23% baseline, climbing to 56% by month 6. Medical notes documented adjustment challenges and mild stress responses. Recommended continuation. Year 2. Expanded testing, precognitive trials using randomized light sequences, empathic assessment using photograph analysis. Success rates climbing across all metrics. Medical notes mentioned headaches, insomnia, minor behavioral regression. Recommended increased dosage of compliance medications. The specific drugs weren't listed. Year 3. Real-world applications introduced. Sarah was shown photographs of Soviet military installations and asked to describe details not visible in the images. Her responses were cross-referenced against satellite intelligence. The accuracy ratings were redacted even within this classified file, covered by black marker that had bled through the paper beneath. But someone had written in the margin, in pencil, small enough that it had almost escaped notice. Impossible. Check source contamination. And below that, in different handwriting, source contamination ruled out, results valid, continue protocols. Year 4. The entries became sparse. No more detailed testing logs, just periodic notations. Performance nominal. Within acceptable parameters. Psychological stability maintained. The medical examinations grew more concerning. Elevated cortisol levels, chronic sleep disruption, dissociative episodes during high-stress testing. The doctor recommended reducing the program intensity. That recommendation was stamped with a single word: Overruled. And then, December 18th, 1957. A final entry in handwriting that looked hurried, almost excited. Subject demonstrates optimal capability for operational deployment. Remote viewing accuracy 89%, precognitive testing 52%, p less than 0.001. Empathic assessment 91%. Psychological conditioning complete. Subject shows appropriate compliance with handler directives and no residual attachment to pre-program identity. Recommend immediate transfer to Directorate of Plans for field utilization. Request approved by DD/P. Transfer effective December 18, 1957. Project Songbird objectives achieved. Subject 0 successful. Helen read the last line 3 times. Subject 0 successful. Not Subject 1. 0. The prototype. The proof of concept. She looked up at Thatcher, who'd been watching her read. How many files are there? 43. And they all have death certificates? Every single one. Different causes, different dates, all within weeks of intake. All accidental. And all of them have medical records continuing for years afterward. Helen set down the Whitmore file and walked to the wall where the names were written. She counted them slowly, matching them against the mental list of files she'd just been told about. 43 names on the wall, 43 files on the tables. But something bothered her. The handwriting of the wall inscription was shaky, uneven, not the controlled precision of the file entries. This had been written by someone under emotional duress, someone who'd stayed behind after the program ended, alone in this room, compiling a memorial that would never be seen, unless they'd wanted it to be found eventually. She turned back to Thatcher. The Directorate of Plans became the Directorate of Operations in 1973. I'll need access to their archives from 1957 forward. Personnel files, operational records, anything involving female assets with no documented background. And I'll need everything the Office of Scientific Intelligence produced between 1951 and 1964, including the files that were supposedly destroyed after the Church Committee hearings. Thatcher handed her a card with a phone number. 2 weeks. The director wants answers about what happened here, where these children went, and why someone sealed this room instead of just burning everything. Helen pocketed the card and gathered the 4 thickest files. Whitmore, Cole, Dern, and Hughes. The ones with the most detailed records. The ones that would give her the best chance of finding traces in the operational archives. As she walked toward the opening in the wall, she paused and looked back at the room one last time. 43 girls, taken from orphanages across the East Coast, erased from official existence, transformed into something the Cold War needed badly enough to justify what had been done to them. And then, if that final entry in Sarah Whitmore's file was any indication, deployed into the field as intelligence assets, children turned into spies, or worse, children turned into weapons. Helen climbed through the opening and headed for the stairs, already planning her research strategy. She'd find out what happened to them, where they'd gone after leaving this facility, whether any of them were still alive. She had a terrible suspicion that the answer to that last question would be no, but she needed to know for certain. And she needed to know what they'd been used for during the years between their fake deaths and their real ones. The files she carried felt heavier with each step toward the surface. By the time she reached her car, she'd made a decision. This wouldn't be just another internal history that got filed away in a classified vault. Whatever she found, however bad it was, someone outside the agency needed to know. Not now. Not until she had the full picture, but eventually. Some truths were too important to stay buried, even if digging them up destroyed careers and reputations, even if one of those careers was her own. She set the files on her passenger seat, started the engine, and drove toward Langley through the November darkness, already composing the first queries she'd run through the archives. Behind her, the old Agricultural Research Center sat under armed guard, its secret finally exposed after 29 years. But Helen suspected that what they'd found in that sealed room was just the beginning. The real horror was still hidden, scattered across decades of operational records, buried under code names and redacted passages, and she was going to find every piece of it. Helen's first query hit the archive system at 6:47 a.m., before most of Langley had finished their first coffee. She'd been awake since 3, unable to sleep after reading through the Whitmore file twice more in her apartment. The clinical precision of the entries kept circling through her mind. The way they documented a child's transformation with the same detached methodology you'd use to track a laboratory experiment, which, she supposed, was exactly what it had been. The query was simple. Cross-reference all Office of Scientific Intelligence personnel files from 1951 to 1964 with any mentions of recruitment, juvenile subjects, or institutional partnerships. The system would take hours to process it, scanning through millions of pages of documents, most still on microfiche or paper, only partially digitized. While she waited, she turned to the easier question: where had the children come from? The intake files listed originating institutions for each subject. Sarah Whitmore, Philadelphia Children's Home. Elizabeth Morrison, St. Catherine's Orphanage, Philadelphia. Jennifer Cole, Baltimore Home for Friendless Children. Margaret Dern, Richmond Protestant Orphan Asylum. Helen pulled up a map and began marking locations. A pattern emerged within the first dozen files. Every single institution was on the East Coast, within a day's drive of Langley. Every single one was privately run, operating with minimal state oversight. And every single one had financial records showing regular payments from an organization called the American Youth Development Foundation between 1951 and 1963. She'd never heard of the American Youth Development Foundation. That wasn't surprising. CIA front organizations numbered in the hundreds during the Cold War, many created for single operations and dissolved immediately after. But something about the name nagged at her. It was too earnest, too obviously benevolent. The best covers were usually more mundane. Import-export companies, consulting firms, organizations boring enough that no one looked twice. This sounded like someone had tried too hard. She ran the foundation through the registry of CIA proprietaries and got nothing. Not dissolved, not transferred, simply absent, as if it had never existed in official records. But the financial transactions were real. She could see them in the orphanage ledgers she'd pulled from state archives. Quarterly payments, always the same amount, always with the same notation. Educational assessment services. Helen sat back and considered what that meant. Someone had created a front organization specifically for Project Songbird, kept it completely off the books at CIA, and used it to funnel money to orphanages in exchange for access to their children. And when the program ended, they'd erased the foundation so thoroughly that even internal agency records had no trace of it. That level of compartmentalization suggested someone very senior had been running this operation. Someone with the authority to move money outside normal channels and make entire organizations disappear from the historical record. Her computer chimed. The first query had returned results. 247 documents mentioning OSI recruitment activities during the target period. Helen began reading. Most were mundane. Recruitment of scientists, technicians, analysts. Standard hiring procedures for a growing intelligence agency. But 17 documents referenced something different. Special recruitment protocols for enhanced perception research. She opened the first one, dated March 1951, marked Confidential, Eyes Only. It was a memorandum from Dr. James Keller, Chief of OSY's Applied Sciences Division, to the Deputy Director of Intelligence. The subject line read, Proposal for Juvenile Subject Testing in ESP Applications. Helen read it twice, her coffee growing cold beside her. Keller's logic was coldly persuasive. Adult subjects in ESP testing showed inconsistent results, likely due to cognitive rigidity and cultural conditioning against acceptance of non-rational phenomena. Children, particularly those aged 6 to 12, demonstrated greater neurological plasticity and reduced skeptical interference. More importantly, children from institutional settings offered significant operational advantages. No family connections to complicate security. Legal guardianship held by state entities that rarely investigated placements thoroughly, and minimal social visibility that would prevent public inquiry if subjects were relocated. The memo recommended a pilot program of 20 subjects to be selected from orphanages and tested under controlled conditions. If results proved promising, expansion to broader implementation would be considered. At the bottom of the page, handwritten in fountain pen, approved for implementation. Establish appropriate cover structure. DDI, March 15, 1951. 3 weeks later, the American Youth Development Foundation was incorporated in Delaware. Helen pulled up the incorporation documents. The foundation's stated purpose was advancement of educational opportunities for disadvantaged youth. Its board of directors consisted of 5 names she didn't recognize. She ran each name through CIA personnel databases. All 5 were CIA officers, mostly from the Office of Security, the division that handled agency facilities and personnel protection, people who knew how to keep secrets and maintain compartmentalization. The foundation's registered address was a law office in Wilmington. Helen called the number listed, disconnected. She checked property records. The building had been demolished in 1978. Dead end after dead end. Whoever had set this up had been meticulous. She moved on to the next document. A budget proposal from June 1951, requesting funding for facility preparation and subject acquisition. The numbers were substantial. $340,000 for facility renovation, $120,000 annually for subject maintenance, and $50,000 for institutional partnerships. The facility was listed only by a project designation. Site 7, Langley Campus. Helen felt something click into place. The Agricultural Research Center had been built in 1952, according to its public records, but the land it sat on had been part of the original CIA campus, acquired in 1947. If they'd been renovating an existing structure rather than building new, she pulled up the historical property records for the Langley area and found it, a Depression-era vocational school, abandoned in 1948, located on what was now the northwest corner of the CIA campus. The building had been deeded to the Department of Agriculture in 1951 for agricultural research purposes. Except the Department of Agriculture had no records of ever conducting research there, because they hadn't. It was a cover, a bureaucratic shell that let CIA operate a classified facility under civilian agency designation. Helen mapped the old vocational school's location against modern campus geography. The Agricultural Research Center, the building being demolished when the sealed room was discovered, sat on exactly the same footprint. They'd taken an abandoned school, renovated it for their purposes, and hidden it in plain sight by labeling it agricultural research. Elegant in its simplicity. She returned to the budget documents and found the operational timeline. Initial renovations, August to November 1951. First subject intake, March 1952. Full operational capacity, June 1952. But the intake files she'd reviewed showed Sarah Whitmore arriving in March 1953, a full year after the facility became operational. She pulled up the complete list of 43 subjects and sorted by intake date. The earliest arrival was actually Rebecca Chen, age 7, dated March 22, 1952, exactly 1 year before Sarah Whitmore, to the day. Helen opened Chen's file, which she hadn't examined closely during her initial review at the site. It was thin, much thinner than the others. Just 12 pages covering 8 months. March to November 1952. The intake evaluation showed similar markers to the other subjects: high intelligence, strong performance on initial ESP protocols, orphan status with no family connections. The first 3 months of testing showed promising results: 34% accuracy on remote viewing, 28% on precognitive trials. Then the notes began to deteriorate. June 1952. Subject showing increased stress response, accuracy declining, behavioral issues emerging. July. Subject non-compliant with testing protocols. Psychological evaluation indicates anxiety disorder development. August. Subject demonstrates persistent refusal to participate. Recommend termination from program. September. Subject transferred to St. Elizabeth's Hospital for psychiatric evaluation and treatment. St. Elizabeth's, the federal psychiatric facility in Washington, D.C., where CIA had sent numerous inconvenient people over the years under various pretexts. Helen searched for any follow-up on Rebecca Chen. Nothing in the Project Songbird files. She expanded the search to St. Elizabeth's admission records, most of which were still sealed under patient privacy laws, even for individuals who'd been committed over 40 years ago. But she found a death certificate. Rebecca Chen, age 7, died November 18, 1952, at St. Elizabeth's Hospital. Cause of death, pneumonia. 8 months after intake. The first subject. Helen felt something cold settle in her chest. She went back through the files, looking for other early terminations. Subject 4. David Lynn, age 8, intake June 1952. Transferred to alternative program, December 1952. No death certificate found, no further records. Subject 6. Patricia Reeves, age 9, intake August 1952. Removed from program due to medical complications, January 1953. Death certificate from Philadelphia. Heart failure, age 9. Subject 9. Thomas Wright, age 10. Intake November 1952. File contained only 2 months of records before a single stamped notation. Subject unsuitable, terminated. No transfer, no death certificate, no indication of where he'd gone. Helen counted carefully. Of the first 15 subjects admitted between March and December 1952, only 3 remained in the program longer than a year. The others had been removed, transferred, or simply disappeared from documentation. The learning curve. They'd been refining their selection criteria, their testing methods, their conditioning protocols, and the children who didn't respond correctly had been discarded. She thought about that word choice. Discarded. Like failed experiments. Like materials that hadn't met quality standards. By 1953, when Sarah Whitmore arrived, they'd figured out what worked. The intake evaluations became more sophisticated, the psychological screening more precise. The success rate improved dramatically. 37 of the final 28 subjects admitted between 1953 and 1957 remained in the program for at least 2 years. And of those 37, 24 showed the same final notation that had appeared in Sarah's file. Transfer to Directorate of Plans approved. 24 children, trained and conditioned and deployed into operational roles. Helen's second query finished processing. Cross-reference of Directorate of Plans personnel files from 1957 to 1975, with any female assets lacking documented background prior to agency employment. 73 results. She began opening files at random, looking for patterns. Most were legitimate recruits. Women who joined CIA through normal channels, college graduates, military transfers, a few defectors from Soviet bloc countries. Their backgrounds were thoroughly documented, employment histories verified, educational credentials confirmed. But 6 files stood out. They were sparse, containing only operational records with no intake documentation. No college transcripts, no previous employment history, no family background. Each woman had simply appeared in the personnel system in the late 1950s or early 1960s, already cleared for operational deployment, already assigned to field stations. The files listed them by cryptonym only, the random 2-word codes CIA used for operational security. AEVULTURE-7, QJCANNON-3, AEOWL-12. Helen cross-referenced the physical descriptions in the operational files against the intake records from Project Songbird. A. Vulture. 7. Female. 5 feet 4 inches, brown hair, brown eyes, birth date listed as 1942. First appeared in personnel records in January 1958. Assigned to Berlin Station. No prior documentation. Sarah Whitmore's intake file listed her height at 4 feet 8 inches at age 9, with brown hair and brown eyes. If she'd continued growing normally, she would have been 5 feet 4 inches or 5 feet 5 inches by age 14. Her birth date was March 1944, but the operational file had aged her down by 2 years. Old enough to pass as an adult operative, young enough to maintain the fiction of a plausible recruitment age. Helen pulled up AEVULTURE7's operational record and began reading. The asset had been deployed in East Berlin from 1958 to 1962, working under commercial cover as a translator. Her assignment was damage assessment. Interview defectors, assess their credibility, evaluate the intelligence they provided. The success rate was extraordinary. Of 47 defectors she'd interviewed, she'd identified 12 as plants sent by Soviet intelligence to feed disinformation. All 12 were later confirmed as double agents through independent sources. Her handler's notes were effusive. Asset demonstrates uncanny ability to detect deception, recommends investigation of subjects based on intuition that consistently proves accurate. Unable to articulate methodology, describes process as sensing when subject is lying. Invaluable for operational security. Uncanny ability. Sensing. Unable to articulate methodology. Because she'd been trained since age 9 to trust perceptions that weren't quite rational, to accept information that came from sources she couldn't explain. They'd conditioned her to use abilities that normal adults had been socialized to suppress, and then they'd aimed her at the Cold War's most critical vulnerability, knowing who to trust. Helen checked the end of AEVULTURE7's file. December 1962. Asset relocated to Saigon Station for expanded operations. June 1965. Asset demonstrates declining performance. Psychological evaluation indicates chronic stress disorder. Recommend rotation to domestic assignment. September 1965. Asset failed to report for scheduled handler meeting. Investigation ongoing. November 1965. Asset located deceased in Berlin safe house. Cause of death, self-inflicted gunshot wound. Investigation concluded. Operational security maintained. Age 23, if the falsified birth date was accurate. Age 21, if Helen's theory was correct, and AEVULTURE7 was actually Sarah Whitmore. 7 years of operational deployment. 7 years of using abilities that had been burned into her neural pathways as a child. Abilities that probably came with psychological costs the handlers hadn't bothered to track until they became operationally inconvenient. And then a gun in a Berlin safe house, and a death that would never be publicly acknowledged because the person who died had never officially existed. Helen sat back from her computer, feeling sick. She checked the other 5 files with similar patterns. QJCANNON-3. Deployed to Vienna 1959 to 1964. Specialty: advanced scouting of meeting locations, identifying security vulnerabilities. Handler notes described preternatural spatial awareness and ability to detect surveillance that technical sweeps missed. Died in a car accident in Vienna, 1964, age approximately 24. AEOWL-12. Deployed to Cairo 1960 to 1967. Specialty: assessment of asset reliability and opposition intelligence officer profiling. Died of apparent hepatitis in Cairo, 1967, age approximately 25. 3 others with similar patterns. Brief operational careers, specialized in assessment and intuition-based analysis. Early deaths from causes that could be natural, accidental, or carefully staged. None had made it past age 26. Helen pulled up actuarial tables for comparison. The expected lifespan for American women in the 1960s was 73 years. The probability of 6 healthy women in their early 20s all dying within a 9-year span was astronomically low, unless the work they were doing was killing them, or unless someone was killing them when they became unstable, unreliable, or started asking questions about their own pasts. She thought about Sarah Whitmore at age 9, scoring 89% on remote viewing protocols, obediently describing the contents of sealed envelopes because that's what the doctors told her to do. She thought about Sarah Whitmore at age 14, transferred to operational deployment, given a new identity and a cryptonym and a handler who sent her into East Berlin to detect Soviet deception. And she thought about Sarah Whitmore at age 21, sitting in a Berlin safe house with a gun, 7 years into a career she'd never chosen, using abilities she'd been conditioned to accept as normal, probably suffering from psychological trauma that no one had bothered to treat because operatives were assets, not people. The file didn't say whether she'd pulled the trigger herself or whether someone had made it look that way. Helen suspected she'd never know for certain. She printed the 6 operational files and added them to the growing stack of evidence on her desk. 6 confirmed deployments out of 24 subjects marked for operational transfer. Where were the other 18? She expanded her search parameters, looking for any female assets with anomalous employment patterns between 1957 and 1975. The system flagged 43 more possibles. This was going to take weeks. Her phone rang. Thatcher. She picked up, and he didn't bother with greeting. "I'm sending you 3 boxes of documents we found in a storage unit in Alexandria. The rental was paid through an account traced back to the American Youth Development Foundation. Someone's been maintaining it for 30 years. Helen felt her pulse quicken. "What's in them?" "Contracts, letters, financial records, and a complete list of every orphanage they approached between 1950 and 1963. He paused. "There are 147 institutions on that list, Dr. Carey. They only partnered with 18, but they approached 147. Helen did the math. 43 subjects over 12 years from 18 institutions. If they'd succeeded in partnering with all 147 orphanages they'd contacted, they were planning something much larger. That's what it looks like. The documents suggest Project Songbird was intended as a pilot program. If it succeeded, they were going to expand nationwide. Thousands of subjects, not dozens." Helen closed her eyes. "What stopped them?" "We don't know yet. The documents end abruptly in late 1963. No explanation, just a final memo dated November 30th, 1963, stating that the program was being terminated and all physical evidence should be disposed of according to standard protocols." Thatcher's voice carried a strange note. "The memo is signed by Richard Helms." Richard Helms, Deputy Director of Plans in 1963, later Director of CIA. The man who'd overseen some of the agency's most controversial operations and later destroyed the MK-Ultra files to prevent congressional investigation. If Helms had personally ordered Project Songbird terminated, something significant had happened. Something serious enough that even the CIA's most notorious secret keeper had decided this particular program needed to end. "The boxes will arrive this afternoon. Clear your schedule." Thatcher hung up. Helen sat in her office, surrounded by files documenting children who'd been erased and turned into weapons, and tried to imagine what could have possibly made the agency decide this had gone too far. It would have to be something catastrophic. Something that threatened exposure, or demonstrated that the program was too dangerous to continue, or proved that what they were doing to these children had consequences they hadn't anticipated. She pulled up a calendar for November 1963 and stared at it for a long moment before the significance hit her. November 22nd, 1963. Dallas. President Kennedy assassinated. The memo terminating Project Songbird was dated 8 days later. Helen didn't believe in coincidences, especially not in intelligence work. She began searching for any connection between Project Songbird subjects and Dallas in November 1963, knowing she probably wouldn't find anything in official records, but unable to stop herself from looking. The system returned 0 results. But absence of evidence wasn't evidence of absence. If something had happened in Dallas that involved one of the Songbird assets, and if that something had scared Richard Helms badly enough to shut down the entire program, those records would have been destroyed first. She sat back and considered the implications. 43 children, taken from orphanages and trained to perceive things that shouldn't be possible. 24 of them deployed into operational roles. 6 confirmed dead by their mid-20s. 18 unaccounted for. And somewhere in that timeline, something had gone catastrophically wrong. Wrong enough that the program was terminated immediately, the facility sealed, the records hidden, and the truth buried for 30 years. Helen had 2 weeks to figure out what that catastrophic failure had been. She suspected that when she found the answer, it would be worse than anything she'd imagined so far. The boxes from Alexandria arrived at 3 p.m., delivered by 2 security officers who made her sign for them in triplicate and verified her clearance before they'd release the contents. She opened the first box and began reading contracts between the American Youth Development Foundation and the Philadelphia Children's Home, dated April 1951. The language was careful, legally precise, and utterly chilling in its implications. The foundation would provide educational and psychological assessment services for children aged 6 to 12. Assessments would be conducted at foundation facilities. Children demonstrating exceptional potential would be eligible for advanced placement opportunities. The orphanage would receive $500 per child assessed, plus quarterly payments of $200 for each child placed in the advanced program. Blood money, Helen thought. Payment for looking the other way when children disappeared. She found similar contracts with 17 other institutions, all structured identically, all offering the same financial incentives. And beneath the contracts, she found something worse. Letters. Dozens of them, written by orphanage directors to the foundation, asking about specific children who'd been placed in the advanced program, asking when they could visit, asking for progress reports, asking eventually, with increasing desperation, whether the children were all right. The foundation's responses were formulaic. The child is progressing well in their placement. For privacy and security reasons, we cannot provide specific location information. We will forward your letter to their current guardians. Helen found no evidence that letters were ever forwarded. She found, instead, a separate folder containing blank death certificates, pre-signed by cooperating medical examiners in 4 different states. The certificates were undated, with cause of death left blank, ready to be filled in whenever a child needed to be officially erased. She counted them. 50 blank certificates, of which 43 had been used. 7 remained. 7 children they'd planned to take but never did, either because the program ended or because they'd run out of time. Helen pulled out the list of institutions that had been approached but never partnered with. She cross-referenced them against the dates of initial contact. All of the rejections had come early, between 1950 and 1952. After 1952, every orphanage the foundation approached had agreed to the partnership, because by 1952, they'd refined their pitch. They'd learned which directors could be bought, which ones would accept vague assurances, which ones were desperate enough for funding that they wouldn't ask difficult questions. The last box contained financial records, and Helen spread them across her desk, tracing the money trail. The American Youth Development Foundation's funding came from a CIA account designated only by a numerical code. She recognized the structure. Black budget allocation, appropriated from the General Intelligence Fund, requiring no congressional oversight or approval. Between 1951 and 1963, the foundation had distributed $347,000 to orphanages in exchange for access to children. It had spent $1.2 million on facility operations, medical staff, testing equipment, and subject maintenance. And it had paid $890,000 to something listed only as Terminal Services, Inc. Helen had never heard of Terminal Services, Inc. She ran it through every database she could access. No incorporation records, no tax filings, no business licenses. Another front company, deeper and darker than the foundation itself. She checked the dates of payments to Terminal Services. They began in January 1958, exactly when the first SONGBIRD subjects would have reached operational age. The payments continued quarterly through October 1963, then stopped. The amounts varied: $15,000 one quarter, $48,000 the next, $22,000 after that. Not regular salaries. Something else, Helen pulled up the operational files she'd identified earlier and cross-referenced the dates. A EVULTURE-7 died in November 1965. Terminal Services received a payment of $35,000 in December 1965. QJCANNON-3 died in March 1964. Terminal Services received $28,000 in April 1964. She checked the others. Every death was followed within 30 days by a payment to Terminal Services. They were paying someone to clean up, to make deaths look natural or accidental, to ensure that assets who'd become liabilities disappeared quietly without raising questions. Or the thought made her feel physically ill. They were paying Terminal Services to create the deaths in the first place. Retirement packages for operatives who couldn't be allowed to live with what they knew. Helen sat surrounded by evidence of something monstrous and realized she'd only scratched the surface. Somewhere in the remaining 18 unaccounted-for subjects, there had to be the catastrophic failure that ended the program. The incident that made Richard Helms decide this was too dangerous to continue. She began cross-referencing the subject list against every significant intelligence failure, security breach, and unexplained incident between 1957 and 1963. It took her 4 hours, working through dinner and into the evening, and then she found it. Subject 31, Catherine Wells, age 11, intake March 1959. Testing showed exceptional results, particularly in precognitive protocols. Success rate on randomized prediction trials, 64%, sustained over 18 months. Transferred to operational deployment June 1961, age 13. Assigned cryptonym, AEBLADE4. Deployed to Dallas Field Office November 1962. Specialty, Threat Assessment and Advanced Security Evaluation. Helen's hands went still on the keyboard. Dallas Field Office, Threat Assessment, 1 year before the assassination. She pulled up everything she could find on AEBLADE4's operational record. The asset had been assigned to evaluate security for presidential visits, assess crowd threats, identify potential vulnerabilities in protection protocols. Her handler's notes described her performance as extraordinary. Demonstrates ability to identify security concerns that standard assessment overlooks. The file documented her work on 3 presidential visits to Texas between November 1962 and October 1963. And then, on November 1st, 1963, a notation. Asset reported persistent concern regarding Dallas visit scheduled November 22, 1963. Unable to articulate specific threat, but insists vulnerability exists. Recommend additional security review. November 8, 1963. Asset continues to express concern regarding Dallas visit. Has requested direct meeting with Secret Service detail. Request denied. Asset not authorized for direct contact with protective services. November the 15th, 1963. Asset making increasingly specific predictions regarding Dallas visit. Claims certainty of threat to GP Floor. GP Floor, the Secret Service code name for President Kennedy. November 20th, 1963. Asset removed from Dallas assignment due to deteriorating psychological state. Transferred to medical supervision. Recommend psychiatric evaluation. The file ended there. No record of what happened to AEBLADE4 after November 20th. No record of psychiatric evaluation, no death certificate, no transfer notation, nothing. Just a 13-year-old girl, trained since age 11 to predict threats, screaming warnings that no one with authority to act would listen to, and then silenced 2 days before the president was killed in Dallas. Helen checked the date of the memo terminating Project Songbird. November 30th, 1963. 8 days after Dallas. 12 days after Catherine Wells was removed from assignment. She sat back in her chair, her heart pounding. They'd created a child who could see the future, deployed her to assess security threats, and when she tried to warn them that the president was going to be killed, they'd locked her away as psychologically unstable. And then, after Dallas, after the catastrophic failure they could have prevented if they'd listened, someone, probably Richard Helms, had made the decision that this program was too dangerous to continue. Not because of what they'd done to the children, Helen realized with cold clarity, but because it had failed when it mattered most, because they'd created an intelligence capability they didn't know how to use, and when it had tried to work exactly as designed, they dismissed it as mental illness. She searched desperately for any trace of Catherine Wells after November 1963. Nothing in the operational archives, nothing in medical records, nothing in terminated employee files. The girl had simply vanished, like so many of the others. But unlike the others, Helen now knew why the program had ended. Not out of conscience or concern for the children they'd exploited, but because they'd failed to prevent Dallas, and someone had to bury the evidence that they'd ignored a warning that might have saved the president's life. Helen gathered all the documents and locked them in her safe. Tomorrow she'd continue tracking the 18 missing subjects. Tonight, she needed to decide what she was going to include in her official report to Thatcher and what she was going to keep to herself until she had undeniable proof. Because if she was right about Dallas, and if she could prove it, this wouldn't just be another buried CIA scandal. It would rewrite the history of the Kennedy assassination, and it would destroy everyone who'd been involved in Project Songbird, including people who were probably still alive and still powerful enough to make problems disappear. Helen turned off her desk lamp and sat in the darkness, thinking about a 13-year-old girl who'd tried to save a president and been locked away for her trouble, wondering if Catherine Wells was still alive somewhere, carrying the knowledge that she'd been right and no one had listened, or if Terminal Services had made sure she'd never tell anyone what she'd seen. Helen didn't go home that night. She sat in her office until the cleaning crew arrived at 11 p.m., watching them work with the detached awareness of someone running on pure adrenaline. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago. She'd stopped tasting it anyway. When the cleaners reached her floor, she gathered the files and moved to one of the secure reading rooms in the basement. Windowless, sterile, designed for researchers who needed to disappear into classified materials for days at a time. The ventilation hummed with a sound that would drive some people insane, but that Helen found oddly comforting. White noise. No distractions. She spread Catherine Wells' file across the metal table, her hands steadier than they should have been given what she was looking at. The official record ended November 20th, 1963. Psychiatric evaluation recommended. No follow-up documentation. But 12 years of reading classified files had taught Helen to find what wasn't written, to see the shapes of things people had tried to erase. She started with Terminal Services. December 1963. Single payment, $127,000. Triple the size of any other transaction in the ledger. Not the cost of making one death look accidental. The cost of making something much bigger disappear. Helen's eyes burned. She rubbed them and checked her watch. 1:23 a.m. The numbers didn't quite register. Time had become abstract, measured only in documents read and connections made. She pulled up personnel records for the Dallas field office, November 1963. Station chief, deceased 1981. Deputy, deceased 1985. Of 12 officers assigned to Dallas that month, only 2 remained alive. Martin Vickers, retired in Scottsdale, and Dorothy Rice, whereabouts unknown since leaving the agency in 1965. Both old enough now that memory would be unreliable even if they agreed to talk. And Dallas was still radioactive territory. No one from that era would break silence about November 1963. Not for a historian with a Q clearance and good intentions. She shifted to medical records instead. If Catherine had been transferred to psychiatric evaluation on November 20th, there should be intake paperwork. CIA used several facilities for psychological crisis. St. Elizabeth's in D.C., a private clinic in McLean, a facility in upstate New York that officially didn't exist. Search parameters. Female patient, age 13 to 15, psychiatric admission between November 15th to 30, 1963. One result. Walter Reed Army Medical Center, November 21st, 1963. Patient admitted under Military Medical Authority. Name redacted, age listed as 14. Helen's vision tunneled slightly. She blinked hard, forcing focus. They'd aged Catherine up by a year to make the admission look legitimate, and buried her in the military medical system, where CIA regularly hid problems that couldn't be acknowledged. The admitting physician was Captain Raymond Foster, U.S. Army Medical Corps. Helen searched his name. Retired 1979, deceased 1988. No personal papers, no interviews, nothing suggesting he'd ever spoken about Walter Reed. But medical records had legal retention requirements. Multiple copies, oversight from military authorities who didn't always cooperate with CIA's cleanup efforts. Harder to destroy than personnel files. Helen submitted a formal request for the patient file, knowing it would take days or weeks to process. Knowing that by the time it arrived, someone might have decided she was asking the wrong questions. She couldn't wait. Her watch read 2:47 a.m. when she finally admitted she needed help from outside official channels. She picked up her phone and called Patricia Odom at home. Patricia answered on the fourth ring, voice thick with sleep and immediately wary. "Helen, it's almost 3 in the morning. I need Walter Reed patient files from November 63. The official request will take too long." Silence. Then, "You know I can't touch those. Everything from that month is still classified at levels that'll get me fired for asking." "What if I told you this connects to Dallas? Something the original investigation missed." The quality of the silence changed. "Jesus, are you serious? A CIA asset tried to warn about the assassination. Specifically enough that if anyone had listened, Kennedy might still be alive. She was 13 years old, and they locked her in a psychiatric ward." Patricia's breath caught audibly. "You can prove this?" "I'm trying to. The Walter Reed file might tell me what happened after they committed her." A long pause. Helen could hear traffic in the background on Patricia's end, the distant wail of a siren. "I can't get you the official file, but there's a researcher, Dr. Thomas Chen at Georgetown. He's writing a medical history of Walter Reed. Been granted access to records most people never see, including redacted files from November 63. Another pause. "If you convince him it's historically important, he might share what he found. But Helen, be careful. You're not just touching classified material. You're touching active political history. If you prove CIA had intelligence that could have stopped Dallas and chose not to act." She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Helen thanked her and hung up, then sat in the fluorescent silence of the reading room, feeling the weight of what she was pursuing settle more heavily. Not just documentation of crimes against children, though that alone was horrifying enough, but potential proof that the agency had intelligence that might have prevented the Kennedy assassination and had dismissed it as mental illness. The kind of proof that could destroy careers, reputations, institutional credibility. The kind of proof that people killed to protect. Her hands were shaking slightly when she picked up her pen to make notes. Exhaustion or fear, she wasn't sure which. Possibly both. She forced herself to shift focus, to work a different angle while waiting for morning when she could contact Georgetown. 18 unaccounted subjects. The ones who'd been trained, deployed, or transferred, and then vanished when Project Songbird ended. She created a quick reference list, forcing herself to see patterns rather than drowning in individual tragedies. 12 subjects with operational deployment records, last entries between mid-1962 and late 1963-5, correlated with terminal services payments, confirmed terminations. 6 subjects marked special assignment, with no deployment records at all. 1 subject, Catherine Wells, confirmed psychiatric commitment that left 12 people unaccounted for. 7 deployed operatives who'd stopped appearing in records, and 6 transferred to special assignment. Helen pulled up the special assignment files, scanning quickly. All 6 had been transferred between 1956 to 1958. All showed exceptional test results. All disappeared completely after transfer. She searched for special assignment protocols in budget documents and found it. A 1956 allocation for advanced research continuation, routed through project account MKOFTEN. Her exhausted brain took a moment to place the name, then memory clicked. MKOFTEN, one of the MK Ultra sub-programs. The fragments that had survived the 1973 destruction suggested it focused on chemical enhancement of perceptual abilities. Helen pulled up what little remained of MKOFTEN documentation and found a casualty report from July 1958. Subject, name redacted, died during clinical trial. Age 14, cause of death, cerebral hemorrhage following administration of experimental compound UT47. The physician's note was clinical, almost admiring. Subject demonstrated unprecedented remote viewing capability in hours preceding death, achieving 97% accuracy on randomized trials. However, accompanying physiological stress proved fatal. 97% accuracy. A 14-year-old child, chemically enhanced until her brain hemorrhaged from the stress of seeing things human neurology wasn't designed to perceive. Helen stood abruptly, needing to move, and immediately regretted it. The room tilted slightly. She gripped the table edge until her vision steadied. When had she last eaten? Yesterday lunch, maybe. Her body was running on caffeine and outrage, neither of which were sustainable fuels. She sat back down carefully and checked her watch. 4:51 a.m., close enough to morning. She could call Georgetown at 9. She spent the intervening hours forcing herself through the remaining files methodically, making notes, building timeline correlations. The work was numbing, which helped. Names and dates and reference numbers, assembling the documentary skeleton of atrocity. By 8:30 a.m., she'd compiled everything she could without accessing the Walter Reed files directly. She called Georgetown at 8:55. Dr. Thomas Chen agreed to meet at 9:30. His voice careful when she identified herself as CIA, researching Cold War medical programs. Not hostile, but not welcoming either. The voice of someone who'd learned caution. Helen drove through morning traffic on autopilot, aware she probably shouldn't be operating a vehicle on no sleep and too much coffee. The November morning was cold and bright, the kind of weather that felt aggressively normal given what she was carrying in her briefcase. Georgetown's campus was just waking up. Students heading to early classes, faculty clutching coffee cups. Helen felt decades older than all of them, separated by knowledge that couldn't be unlearned. Chen's office was exactly what she'd expected. Cramped, overfilled with books and documents, the organized chaos of serious academic work. Chen himself was perhaps 60, thin and precise, watching her with the neutral assessment of someone who'd learned to be wary of government officials bearing questions. He didn't offer coffee or pleasantries, just waited. Helen had rehearsed this approach during the drive. Too much truth would sound paranoid. Too little would get her nothing. I'm investigating a classified program that used children as experimental subjects in the 50s and 60s. I have evidence that one subject was committed to Walter Reed in November 1963. The records are redacted, but I was told you might have access to files from that period. Chen's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the quality of his attention. What makes you think I'd share classified medical records with a CIA historian? Fair question. Helen met his eyes. Because I think you found something that's been bothering you. Something from November '63 that doesn't make sense unless there's context you don't have. And because I'm not here to bury this, I'm here to document it. A long pause. Chen stood and moved to a filing cabinet, his movements deliberate. He pulled out a thick accordion folder and set it on the desk between them without opening it. I've been working on a history of Walter Reed's psychiatric services for 8 years. Army gave me conditional access to patient records with the understanding that nothing gets published without clearance. He rested one hand on the folder. I found something in the November '63 admissions. Troubled me enough that I've spent 2 years trying to get additional context. He opened the folder and removed a photocopied intake form, sliding it across the desk. Helen read it, her fatigue evaporating into sharp focus. Patient admitted November 21st, 1963, 14:37 hours. Female, age 14, name redacted. Admitting authority, CIA Medical Services. Diagnosis, Acute delusional disorder with specific fixation on threat to federal official. Chen slid another document across. Initial evaluation, written 6 hours after admission. The handwriting was cramped, rushed, the notes of a physician working quickly. Patient highly intelligent, articulate, oriented to person/place/time. No evidence of thought disorder or perceptual disturbance beyond primary delusion. Patient insists she has been trained in threat assessment and has foreseen specific danger to the president during upcoming Dallas visit. Becomes agitated when informed her concerns have been reviewed and dismissed. Claims precognitive capability. States Kennedy will be killed by rifle fire from elevated position. When challenged on specificity, patient becomes tearful. I can see it. I've seen it for weeks. Why won't anyone listen? Assessment. Elaborate delusional system, possibly induced by psychological conditioning. Recommend psychiatric hold. Patient should be kept under observation and prevented from contact with outside authorities. The evaluation was dated November 21, 1963, at 21:15 hours. 15 hours before Kennedy was shot from an elevated position in Dallas. Helen set down the document with hands that had gone numb. Chen slid a series of progress notes across the desk. His voice was quiet. These cover November 22nd through 30. November 22nd, 0800. Patient spent night in acute distress, repeatedly stating, "Today is the day," and requesting permission to contact Secret Service. Request denied. Patient sedated at 6:30 for her own safety. November 22nd, 1547. Patient became hysterical upon learning of events in Dallas. Required physical restraint and heavy sedation, screaming, I told them, why didn't they listen?" Patient remains under suicide watch. Helen stopped reading. The fluorescent lights were too bright suddenly, the office air too close. She forced herself to continue. November 23rd to 25th. Brief entries documenting continued sedation, minimal responsiveness, refused food. November 26th. Patient's condition deteriorating, no longer speaking, unresponsive to verbal stimuli. Recommend transfer to long-term care facility. November 27th. Transfer approved. Patient to be relocated to redacted under ongoing psychiatric hold. November 30th. Patient transferred per authorization. File closed. No record of destination, no follow-up, just closed. Helen looked up at Chen and saw her own horror reflected in his careful academic face. I spent 2 years trying to find where they sent her, he said. Transfer authorization classified above my clearance. Facility name redacted everywhere. Army Medical Command stonewalled me. So did CIA Historical Office and the National Archives. He paused. Then I started getting calls, polite suggestions that I should focus my research on less sensitive periods. They warned you off. Firmly enough that I understood the message. Chen leaned back. I'm a historian, Dr. Carey. I document what I can access and note what's been suppressed. But I can't pursue leads requiring resources and authority I don't have. He pushed the folder toward her. You, however, work for CIA. You have clearances and access I'll never get. If you're investigating the program this girl came from, you might find what happened to her. Helen picked up the folder, feeling its weight. Can I keep these? They're copies, but I want something in return. Chen's voice was steady, but his eyes held something harder. The truth, when you find it. Not the sanitized version that gets buried. The real truth, even off the record. I've spent 8 years wondering about the girl who tried to warn someone and got locked away for it. I need to know if she survived. Helen met his gaze and understood. This was the same choice she'd been facing. Look away and stay safe, or document the truth regardless of cost. You'll know everything I find. You have my word. She left Georgetown with the folder and drove back to Langley through midday traffic, her exhaustion now competing with a sick urgency. The pieces were assembling into something worse than she'd imagined. Not just exploitation of children for intelligence purposes. Not just chemical experiments that killed subjects in pursuit of enhanced abilities, but a 13-year-old girl, trained since age 11 to perceive threats, who had tried to use her conditioning exactly as designed and had been silenced because no one could accept that she might be right. And then Dallas happened, exactly as she'd predicted. And 8 days later, Project Songbird was terminated. Helen spent the afternoon in the archives, searching for the transfer authorization that would tell her where Catherine Wells had been sent from Walter Reed. She found 3 officers who'd processed psychiatric transfers in late 1963. 2 were dead. 1, Gerald Morse, retired case officer, was still alive in Arlington. She called him at 4:17 p.m., her voice hoarse from disuse. He was wary immediately when she identified herself. "I'm retired. Whatever you're calling about, I can't help." Project Songbird. November 1963. You processed a transfer authorization for a 13-year-old girl who tried to warn about Dallas. The silence stretched so long, Helen thought he'd hung up. Then quietly, "You should stop this investigation. Nothing good will come of it. I need to know what happened to her, where she was sent." "Why?" Morse's voice carried decades of weight. "She's gone. They're all gone. Digging this up won't bring them back. Because someone needs to document what was done, because those children deserve to be remembered." Another long pause. When Morse spoke again, he sounded older, exhausted. "Pine Ridge Institute, Western Maryland. Private psychiatric facility. Did government contract work. We sent her there November 27th, 63. Administrative psychiatric hold, indefinite duration." He stopped, then continued more quietly. "I signed that authorization 30 years ago. Regretted it every day since. She was 13 years old, and she was right. She knew, and we locked her away because we couldn't handle the implications of what that meant." "Do you know if she's still alive?" "No. After the transfer, there was never any follow-up. She just disappeared." Helen thanked him, hearing in his voice the same guilt Chen had carried, the same weight she was beginning to feel. She searched for Pine Ridge Institute records. The facility had closed in 1987. Closure documentation listed 147 patient files transferred back to referring agencies. CIA had received 32. Helen requested access to all 32. The request was denied within 40 minutes. Records sealed pending ongoing legal review. Access restricted to GC authorization only. General Counsel authorization, the highest restriction level, used for documents with potential legal liability, which meant the files contained something explosive enough that CIA's lawyers had locked them down permanently. Helen sat at her desk, staring at the denial notice, and felt the investigation hit a wall she couldn't break through official channels. She picked up her phone and called Thatcher. When he answered, she said, "I found the girl who tried to warn about Dallas, and I need your help getting to the rest of the truth because I've hit classification barriers I can't cross alone." A pause. Then Thatcher's voice, carefully neutral. "My office. Now. Bring everything." Helen gathered the files, Catherine Wells, the terminal services ledgers, the Walter Reed documents, the MKOFTEN casualty report, and headed for the 7th floor. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. Exhaustion had burned through into a kind of clarity. She was about to tell a senior CIA officer that the agency had intelligence that might have prevented the Kennedy assassination and had dismissed it as a teenage girl's delusion. Either Thatcher would give her the resources to finish the investigation, or he'd shut her down and bury everything she'd found. Either way, she was past the point of turning back. The elevator rose through Langley's floors, carrying her toward a conversation that would determine whether Catherine Wells's story would finally be told or disappear back into classification for another 30 years. Helen stepped out on the 7th floor, files clutched against her chest, and walked toward Thatcher's office. The truth about Project Songbird was too important to bury again, even if exposing it cost her everything. It cost her everything.